Okay, I think we're ready to go ahead and get started. Welcome in, everybody. We have a very special episode of For the Love of Language today. Hi, by the way, this is the For the Love of Language podcast. I can talk. I'm Stacy the linguist.
I'm authentically EJ, and we have our special guest with us today, Katherine Cowley.
Hi, it's great to be here.
Yeah, so I'll go ahead and give Katherine a little bit of an introduction here, and then we'll dive into some really interesting conversation. So Katherine Cowley read Pride and Prejudice for the first time when she was 10 years old, which started a lifelong obsession with Jane Austen. She is the author of the Jane Austen Writing Lessons blog, which uses Jane Austen's novels to teach writing. Her debut novel, The Secret Life of Miss Mary Bennet, was nominated for the Mary Higgins Clark Award. She is also the author of The True Confessions of a London Spy and The Lady's Guide to Death and Deception. She loves history, chocolate, traveling, and playing the piano, and she teaches writing classes at Western Michigan University. So Katherine has a ton of excellent experience, and we're super, super excited to have her on the podcast.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Yeah, this is really exciting. Hey, I like chocolate too.
Right? Don't we all?
Yeah. So in this podcast, we're less talking about like actual hardcore linguistic stuff, and we're more curious about language and sort of like the historical take on language. And our friend Katherine here happens to be a bit of an expert when it comes to like using language in a historical way that even modern people can connect to. Katherine, can you like tell us a little bit about your connection with language and history and writing? I know that's a very broad question. We can get more specific.
So, I knew that I wanted to write a novel which used Jane Austen's character, Mary Bennet. And I wanted it to be a very historically grounded novel. And so, I've been reading, Jane Austen for years, of course, watched all the movies and everything. But it's very different when you actually go to write a book inspired by a novelist from 200 years ago, because we use language very differently today than we did. And so it was kind of the balance as, okay, I want to tell my own story. I don't want to exactly imitate Jane Austen's exact voice.
Right.
I don't want to, use her exact techniques, and yet I want to give the feel of Jane Austen. I want it to feel like that's something that fits with Jane Austen's novels. And so a lot of it's just trying to figure out, okay, what can I take to make this feel historical, to make this feel accurate, to make it feel like it's in the tradition of Jane Austen, and use those things, but also make it accessible for modern readers, and also allow myself to develop my own narrator voice within that.
I'm really curious. So you've actually written a broad variety of types of writing. I think recently I read one of your short stories that got published in Defenestration magazine, which was like a totally different genre from Jane Austen's. Like you have a broad array of skills and interests. What made you want to focus your books on, in the Jane Austen world specifically?
Well, a lot of it was just down to her characters and feeling like her characters and her approach to storytelling has modern relevance today. I mean, you've got a, woman, Mary Bennet, who, if she does what everyone expects her to do, she's going to live kind of a very miserable, kind of controlled life. And I feel like that has a lot of resonance today. With readers of like, clearly women's rights are at a different place than they were 200 years ago, but clearly there's all these expectations. They're still under attack in many ways. And so it's just interesting to see, like, who can she be? What is her secret life? What are her possibilities? So a lot of it was just me being drawn to the character and loving the time period. And so deciding to go with that. But as you said, I do write in many, I've written many like futuristic sci-fi stories, or, all sorts of different genres as well. So it does definitely require a shift, switching from one to another.
Yeah. Can you tell us a little bit about what kinds of tricks or words, or, you know, what about the writing style really signals that it takes place in Austen's world, even though it is, you know, a different retelling, a different voice, like you were saying?
A lot of it is actually kind of the language and the syntax and the sentence structure. If you just look at kind of modern sentences in a lot of kind of contemporary novels, they're going to be a lot shorter, versus Jane Austen constructs these very elaborate sentences, often, you know, very easy to find sentences over 40 or 50 words if you're outside of dialogue. And we don't write these today. It's funny, when I do my Jane Austen writing lessons, I have a plugin installed on my WordPress website, SEO Yoast, and it's always like, whoa, 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 your language use is too high, your sentences are too long. And I'm like, no, it is not. Well, I'm quoting Jane Austen from my writing lessons. So if someone can read Jane Austen and learn about writing, then they can read my sentences as well. So a lot of it's like the sentence structure, you know, and, you know, kind of these longer sentences and kind of placing these ideas together and developing. There's this sense in the last century, especially within English, you know, you've got Strunk and White with the elements of style. You've got George Orwell, who's like, never use a long word when a short word will do. You've got the CIA helped fund the Iowa Writers Workshop because they saw the MFAs as this like ability for writing to be anti-communist. And so it's a very individualistic, very show don't tell, very concrete, and saying, well, we're anti-style, but no, this is a style. So you have all these things in this last century that are very much favor a particular style of writing, which is one, it is good styles of writing, but you've got Jane Austen, which is part of an older tradition, and, you know, using a very different style, which I think still has value today. So one, I would try to think about syntax and sentence structure, and especially writing the first book in the series, I'd often read some Jane Austen before writing to kind of get the language into my head. And then I would speak out loud to myself in a fake, terrible British accent. I don't have a good fake British accent, but I would try to get that in my head. And so, you know, Miss Mary Bennet found herself, you know, where I'd have to I would have to try to put that, I literally had to be talking aloud to myself to kind of get the syntax, to get the structure, to kind of imitate the voice. So a lot of it is really the syntax. There's also diction and word choice.
Yeah.
So I just, you know, obviously you intuitively do this. You cannot check every single word that you use. But then in the revision stage, I would run things through the Jane Austen thesaurus. You can say, did Jane Austen ever use this word? And you can check and say, oh, she didn't, or she did. Oh, I'm in good shape. Or she spelled this word 2 different ways. So I can choose how I want to spell it. I also used Google Ngram, which lets you look at how words or phrases were used historically. So even if Jane Austen didn't use something, but I'm like, hey, this was used a lot in 1810, and I can go and look at the text and kind of get into that and say, do I want to use it this way? Do I not? You know, did this word exist? So there's, you know, diction and word choice. There's also just, you know, whether it's punctuation or contractions. So punctuation, she uses a lot of em dashes, and she actually uses them a lot more kind of liberally and in more inventive ways than sometimes we limit ourselves today. People are like, oh, em dashes, they're, you know, like they're lesser, or they're like, you know, kind of too informal. And it's like, no, there's actually a lot you can do with em dashes. Contractions, you have Jane Austen's characters never use contractions unless they're characters like Lucy Steele in Sense and Sensibility, who she's trying to be upper class. She's trying to fit into this world, and she can't quite. And her language reflects that. And so even at the time, there are, you know, the Duke of Wellington used contractions in some of his letters. So clearly upper class people did use contractions sometimes, but they don't in Jane Austen's novels.
Right.
They're truly at that kind of that point. Well, you get Lydia Bennet, who does once in Pride and Prejudice, but once again, you know, there's a commentary on her character. So it's just kind of using some of these things that slowly starts to kind of build and create this kind of sense and feel for the language and the time.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. And I think we're especially lucky that like Jane Austen's work was so popular that there are so many resources to like really dig into that sort of thing. Do you think that other historical authors like have this luxury? Would it be easy to try to replicate some like little known author from back in the day?
I mean, it could be a little trickier for sure. If you hit anything after 1800, there's so much has been
Okay.
digitized and so much is available through Google Ngram, which is part of Google Books.
Mhm.
And so anything after 1800 is going to be a little easier to get a sense for the style, and kind of imitate it. And obviously, like, reading it, there's people that have done, linguistic analysis with computer programs, analyzing everything from dialogue tags in different authors in different centuries to, kind of use of adverbs or use of, adjectives. So people are applying, things you guys have talked about in some of your other podcasts, kind of these linguistic analyses to a lot of things. But yes, if you have a lesser known author, you're going to have to do more of the grunt work yourself there.
Wow. That's super, super fascinating. I wouldn't have considered, and this is going back a little bit, but I wouldn't have considered sentence length. Like some things were very obvious when reading your books, like, when you spell color with the British OUR at the end instead of an OR at the end. Like some of those things I think would stand out more to readers who aren't used to that kind of style than things like long sentences and making sure that all of the words that you used were actually in usage in the early 1800s. That's fascinating.
Well, and you have to do the reverse too, in that there's, authors will try to use Tiffany in a medieval text, and readers will be like, "Oh, that's a modern word," and
Yeah.
maybe they'll freak out. But Tiffany's been around for 600-700 years. It's an old word, so you do run into reader expectations as a problem. For example, and I kind of just try to do it balanced. So they would say, instead of if someone was flirting with someone, he made love to her. Well, that means something very different today.
Yeah.
And so even though Jane Austen uses that phrase, he was making love to her. Well, I'm not going to use that because Jane Austen can get away with it in the historical
Right.
context. But even though I'm imitating Jane Austen and writing an Austen-esque novel, it has a risk of being interpreted a very different way. And so I don't write it that way, even though it was historically accurate.
Yeah, no, that's super fascinating. And EJ, I think you brought up like a really good point. There's like, as a writer, you do have to like consider some of these aspects of language that people don't usually think about. Like, I as like a linguist have to think about all these different things that are not in people's like realm of vision. And writers, especially when you're doing something like what Catherine's doing, also have to consider a lot of those like subtextual things, those things that we kind of like know implicitly, but don't talk about all the time, like sentence length and word choice and idiomatic phrases and stuff.
Yeah, you gave a couple really interesting examples of things that you would modify, or maybe instances when you would change your word choice for the modern reader because of how meanings have changed over time. Was there one while you were doing your research and writing that was like the most surprising to you?
That's really tricky. I mean, a few of the things that surprised me were words that were in usage. I'm like, what? They actually use it. I'm using that right? That is that old? I was
Yeah.
right. I can't think of it at the top of my head.
Yeah, that's fine. It was just an interesting thought.
Yeah, I know. Like when I like read through Pride and Prejudice, and Persuasion is another one. There are some words that you tend to stumble on a little bit because you're like, what does that even like mean? But then there are other times where it sounds so normal, which is so fascinating. I kind of want to circle back to dialogue though, because you had mentioned that like as you're creating like the voice, like as you're doing the narration, you had to like say it to yourself out loud. Likewise, how did you approach dialogue between characters?
Yeah, so a lot of it, I mean, it's even a lot of it with Jane Austen is interesting in that she will have a lot fewer dialogue tags than modern writers will often use. And she even wrote in one of her letters after Pride and Prejudice was published, she even wrote to a friend, or maybe it was her sister, there were a few spots where I could have added some he said, she said that would have made it a little more clear, but mine is an intelligent reader, who can handle this. And so, you get with Jane Austen with her dialogue, where when you get into these dialogue passages, she just assumes she has an intelligent reader, and she a lot of times cuts out other things. So there are times where she says this person whispered, or then this person set the letter down on the table. But sometimes when you get into like these really key scenes of dialogue, sometimes all of that will go. You'll have a conversation between Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy. It'll just be dialogue, 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 dialogue. No tags, no other descriptions of how the dance is going, where she's letting the dialogue do the weight. And so that's something where I tried to do, and my writing group would call me on it when they're like, okay, you have to add a dialogue tag here, please. Didn't, so a lot of it was just trying to figure out, okay, how do I kind of build these dialogue scenes so that way they do carry the weight, with the language. So yes, I do have sometimes these actions or these movements or these descriptions, and Jane Austen does use those, but then where I can have kind of the weight of this dialogue, where it's, kind of building. And so, it's like speaking aloud and figuring out, all dialogue should be spoken. All writers should be reading their dialogue aloud, whether or not you're writing something with Jane Austen or modern. Before you hit the final draft, you really should, because dialogue is spoken and you read it aloud and you change it.
Definitely.
But then a lot of it's just like setting up these characters and trying to set them up kind of in the same style Jane Austen does, of, so that way you hit the dialogue is at these key moments. And then she summarizes dialogue when it's not important. And, being willing to do that, we have all this, and this was something that was also really pushed by Iowa Writers Workshop, just the sense of like, show, don't tell, everything should be in scene. You should, but sometimes it's better just to summarize what happened or summarize what they said, because you don't actually need it. And you see Jane Austen doing that so she could focus on the dialogue that actually really matters.
Definitely. That's super interesting. So one question that I have about your dialogue, specifically, kind of an underlying theme of your books is the Napoleonic Wars. And there's, conversations and references to both French and British individuals. And so you do have a little bit of interesting language, I guess, surrounding people coming from different locations. And I don't know how much, Jane Austen pulled in people from different regions in her works. I'm most familiar with Pride and Prejudice. But what did you do to try and make those conversations also be natural when there's people with different native languages?
Part of that is I did draw from my own personal experiences of, living overseas, learning different languages, and thinking about how that actually works. Because I can't think of any moment in Jane Austen's novels, and I may be wrong here, someone can comment on this somewhere, where someone is speaking a foreign language or learning a foreign language. Obviously there's all sorts of references, to Caroline Bingley, and she speaks Italian and French and the modern language, a thorough understanding of the modern languages. Obviously there's this expectation that they would speak it, but it's not on the page. So in part it was drawing on my own experiences and also looking at how other authors use things. Plenty of other authors from the era that do kind of experiment with different things. What's interesting with the Napoleonic Wars is that they are there in her novels, but they're there kind of in the subtext, in the background. And so readers at the time would have seen, especially, for example, in Persuasion, dozens and dozens of references to Napoleonic Wars. But a modern reader, if they're not familiar with the Napoleonic Wars, will not notice any of them, or almost not notice any of them. And so, it's there in the background of her novels, but I was trying to bring it more to the forefront, partly for modern readers and partly because I wanted to kind of explore kind of that interaction more directly, kind of pace politics and these wars in a more forefront position.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I've read the entirety of Persuasion, and I'm like, you're right. Like historically, yes, of course the Napoleonic Wars were going on, but I, as a modern reader, like I'm not reading Jane Austen for subtext about the Napoleonic Wars, right? I'm reading for the romance, for the storytelling, for the characters, for the interesting the little twists here and there. And you wouldn't necessarily pick up on almost. So that's really interesting that you were able to kind of like see that and draw it out a little bit more and kind of highlight it for modern readers.
Yeah, and one of the things I did with that, and that's one of the reasons I chose to have excerpts from real newspapers at the start of each chapter, because then it brings in a lot of historical voices. And you get different newspapers. Some were very liberal, some were very conservative. You know, the Anti-Gallican Monitor, which was the whole point, was we hate France. That was the entire newspaper every single week, was like we hate French people. And so you have, you know, people on all these different sides, these different voices. And I have even some newspaper articles that were translated from French newspapers and put in British newspapers. You know, just wanting to bring in other voices from the era that, you know, modern readers may be less familiar with, kind of create this like parallel narrative to the story that I'm telling.
That's so fascinating. So one question that kind of brings up for me from like a linguistic standpoint, or more along those lines, perhaps. So like when you're in modern writing classes, we're taught to use different registers if you're like writing a letter to someone versus if you're writing a newspaper or writing a story. Do you think that the differences that people are taught to use in like register and style today were also reflected in the differences between what you would see in like Jane Austen's writing in the newspapers back in, you know, the early 1800s?
Such a good question, EJ.
Yeah, I mean, there was definitely, I feel like newspapers were a little more experimental in the 1800s. Like there was a little more leeway for a broader range. So you have poetry published regularly. You have big newspapers publishing these fashion things, and they get into these, you know, very opulent descriptions of the fashions and the feathers and the pelisse and the lace is laying this way and that. But I do feel like there is definitely a different, you know, register of, you know, between, you know, Jane Austen or other novelists of the time, or, you know, Byron or their poetry and stuff, and what you would see in the newspapers, where there is a shift and there is not necessarily more concise. There's still plenty of long sentences, but kind of the style and approach of those sentences, it feels less literary. It feels less, you know, storytelling than, for example, Jane Austen.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. I was partly wondering, like, right now we have these really, really established style guides, like you mentioned, Strunk and White, and, you know, our classes have these very established, you know, ways of doing things that have expanded across the globe really efficiently because of the internet and things. And I know there were style guides and stuff like that back in the early 1800s as well. But yeah, I was just kind of curious, you know, what the biggest differences would be there. So that's interesting.
Well, and you see lots of things. For example, the third book, Lady's Guide to Death and Deception, that's out in September. But you see differences between newspapers, or even differences between days of, you know, you look at like the Allied armies, how that's talked about. So kind of Wellington's heading up the Allied armies with Britain and their friends to defeat Napoleon once again. And Allied armies, sometimes Allied and armies is capitalized. Sometimes Allied is capitalized and armies is not. Sometimes armies is capitalized and Allied is not. And these are all in all the big newspapers. So I look at it, I'm like, so basically I can do whatever I want because you guys did it, you know, so differently. So you had that. Another one that was interesting is Napoleon Bonaparte's name. About half, and I actually kind of standardized it a little bit in the books, kind of standardized the spelling, even though the newspapers weren't. About half of the newspapers, including some of the really big ones, were spelling Bonaparte's name as Buonaparte to emphasize his Italian heritage and show he is an usurper in France. He does not deserve to be there. He does not have the right heritage. So you have even the newspapers, like that was pretty consistent by newspaper, whether they're deciding to call him Bonaparte or Buonaparte, and kind of, you know, so you kind of even have divides like that happening at the time, which is kind of, it's a political statement. It's a, you know, but by that language choice, that newspaper is making a statement on how valid they think Napoleon's rule is.
That's fascinating. I could definitely see that throwing off the modern reader, though, if you were like spelling Napoleon's name differently in every chapter of your book. Like that would definitely be a little odd.
Yeah, so I just standardized the spelling as Bonaparte, but then I had a conversation between Mary and Lainey Trafford about the different spellings because I just thought like this is just such a key linguistic usage. And yet this isn't the point of the story. I can't spell it different ways every other sentence. I can't do that, but I could still bring a, light to this as something that was done.
Yeah. Are there any other like secret little linguistic nuggets that we could look for in your books?
That is a good question. I'm gonna like sit here and read in front of you guys. No, a lot of it was just trying to figure out what are people talking about? What are, how are they talking about it at the time? And how do I approach that? And sometimes what I would find is when I did make a mistake, when I did use a word and then a critique partner or my editor called me on it and I look it up, I'm like, wow, that word didn't exist till 1940. A lot of times it wasn't just, oh, well, what word did? It wasn't just find a synonym. Sometimes with these passages of dialogue, having a single word that didn't exist till after 1930 or 1940, it required me re-envisioning the characters and dialogue and the whole thought process, because if we don't have that word, it's not just what word did they use, it's an entirely different way of thinking a lot of times. If there wasn't a word that existed for this concept until 1940, then they weren't thinking about it in that way. So I can't use a modern way of thinking to describe it or just find a synonym, because that, I'd often rewrite and kind of restructure the whole passage, and it would often be truer to the characters and truer to the time because I'd taken the time to figure out, okay, not just is there a way I can force to say it the way I would say it,
right,
but how they would say it then.
Wow. One thing I would love to dive into a little bit is, that you have taught writing at universities, and having that experience as a writing instructor. I'm curious if you think that changed how you approached writing these books.
In some ways, yes. In some ways, no. So I did a master's in rhetoric and composition, which is kind of the study of how, language works and language is persuasive or language is effective at whatever, fulfilling whatever role it has. And then composition, which is the teaching of writing. And so I did that master's degree at a point in my life where, I'd always had a dream to be a writer, but I'd kind of set that on the back burner. Like maybe I'll do work on this dream someday, maybe I won't. And so, here reading all sorts of, Aristotle and Cicero and then modern theorists on how does language work? How does it, affect people? How and why are things effective or ineffective? And then a few years later, when I started really, becoming serious as a creative writer, I did find that it definitely impacted the way I thought about kind of building words and building structures. And I was just a lot more attuned to the language itself. Right after I finished my master's degree, I did NaNoWriMo and I, wrote a novel in a full month and it was terrible. And I decided I didn't want to be a writer anymore. Fast writing works well for many people, but it did not work well for me.
For those who aren't familiar with NaNoWriMo, NaNoWriMo is short for National Novel Writing Month, and it happens every November. And the goal is to write 50,000 words in a single month. So it's a challenge that a lot of aspiring writers will take on.
Well, and a lot of, professional writers will use it to, help get their next book written, but it didn't work for me. And a few years later, when I started writing again, just kind of the awareness of language that I'd gotten from teaching writing and from studying rhetoric and composition, it made me approach writing kind of in a more slower way, paying more attention to the words and structure, which really is useful for writing a kind of Jane Austen inspired novel. Because for me, if I were to just write without thinking of the language, because some people are like, well, you just revise and you add that later and you work on that, I would have to completely scrap everything, because if your core sentences and the core way you're approaching language just does not match your narrator voice and doesn't match the time period and other things, like it wouldn't have worked for me. So I do think it kind of gave me an awareness of kind of the style that really helped. There's the phrase, the medium is the message. in the sense of that you cannot just separate the style of the language used from the message or the story, like that they influence each other. They are part of each other. So the language that you choose to use, and whether you choose to write things in scene or summary or how you approach dialogue, like that is not like a separate thing from your story. Like these are part of each other. And so, your style is always about your story, and your story is always about the style, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
that's fascinating.
Yeah, absolutely. Thinking back about what you mentioned about, if there's one word that was, out of place, or then you'd have to like rephrase the whole thing and rethink character and stuff. That reminds me a lot of what EJ and I have talked about in terms of like translations with languages, right? Like sometimes a word doesn't exist in another language. So what do you have to do? You have to set your mindset in a different way and come up with a different way of explaining the same thing. And that's what like makes someone a good communicator, a good translator, is being able to take those ideas and like convey it in the same way, even if you don't have the exact words.
And that was strategic competence, is what that's called. That's super, super fascinating. When you're talking about the medium is the message, actually what comes to mind to me, and this is like pretty tangential, not really related to your books, but take, Beowulf, for instance, like super classic old English literature. And, the Old English version is, poetic. And it's a fantastic read for anyone who hasn't read it. But you get a lot of these older works that are poetic, are written in certain ways, and then you get a lot of children's books that take those stories and turn it into a children's book to make it accessible for young readers and to give some people exposure to it, even though it totally changes the medium of the message. Do you have thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, I think some of it just depends on, we look at a text like Beowulf, and Old English is so distant from what English is today. Well, of course, we're going to read it differently. I'm actually trying to find that there's this new translation of Beowulf by Maria Devana Headley. And I need to open up the beginning of this. I just want to read you guys the first sentence.
Yeah.
I think it starts with bro.
Bro.
Yeah, pull it up.
Of course, a modern retelling must start the story with bro. Dearest brethren, my bro Seth.
Okay, here we go. This is this new translation, Headley's translation of Beowulf. But when you read it, it kind of makes you think about how when this was spoken, this is how it would have felt potentially. That it would have, the words would have felt accessible. The words would have felt normal. They wouldn't have felt distant.
Yeah.
So she says in her translation, bro, tell me we still know how to talk about kings. In the old days, everyone knew what men were. Brave, bold, glory bound. Only stories now, but I'll sound the Spear-Dane song hoarded for hungry times. So you still get kind of some of those, things with like the literary language and the poetic devices and stuff, but we're starting with bro, right. And we're starting with, these things. And so when you look at whether it's like a Pride and Prejudice counting book, one English village, two rich gentlemen, I own this. Or whether you're looking at a modern translation of Beowulf, or you're looking at, there's a new novel out that I haven't read yet, but it's called Being Mary Bennet. And it's about a modern contemporary woman who realizes that she actually is Mary Bennet. That, like, her, that is the person that she actually is. It's not Elizabeth. It's not, the heroes. It's Mary Bennet. But a lot of these things, like, and this is something you guys touched on in a different episode, of like, whether it's language as prescriptive or descriptive, of just like, okay, well, these texts, like, is there a specific way we are supposed to use them? Is there only one good way to access Jane Austen or to access Beowulf? And I would argue, no. I would argue, like, let Jane Austen be like Greek mythology, where yes, there's this core that is Greek mythology, but we can have Percy Jackson, and we can have, Disney's version of Hercules, which is really terrible about some aspects of Greek mythology, but is still doing some cool things. Just like this sense that like the literary canon as treating as it something that can be alive and something that can be, played with and isn't fixed. I love there's a modern Pride and Prejudice YouTube series, and
yes, the Lizzie Bennet Diaries.
It came out 10 years ago, so it's kind of celebrating a 10-year thing. And this sense of like, it just brings it alive. It just connects it to modern audiences and modern issues. And Lydia Bennet, instead of, sleeping with someone without being married, well, it's like porn video of her posted on YouTube or something, where you're like, okay, you could see the weight and kind of the consequences of this for someone's life. And I just think that whether you're playing with Jane Austen the way I am, where I'm trying to keep her language in a lot of ways and imitate that and kind of to an extension, or whether you're doing Lizzie Bennet Diaries, or whether you're saying bro for Beowulf, like, literature is meant to live and to grow. And, I kind of like, not prescriptive uses of literature.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely makes it more accessible to people, which I think is really important, because ultimately it's the story that you're telling, not necessarily, I mean, how you tell it is important too, right? Like that has all of this beautiful like history behind it and everything. And it, it has a whole different way to it. But the story itself is ultimately what people love, like the story of Hercules and all these other things, like the tales of Romeo and Juliet get retold like so many times. It's because it's not always about how you say it, and it's not always about how you say it. It's about what you say.
And it shifts what you say, and it shifts the meaning, and it shifts the experience. But there's not one right way for it to be done.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Like if you think about, especially like Shakespeare retellings, it allows for a lot of interpretation, a lot of application, a lot of extension into different thoughts and ideas, using that story that feels similar, but using it in a way to like convey something else, something different. I think that's really awesome.
Yeah, I really, really love that. Katherine, is there anything else that you would like to call out about your books, about your work?
Yeah, brag about yourself for a little bit. Come on now.
Okay, yeah. So Secret Life of Miss Mary Bennet was just nominated for Mary Higgins Clark Award, which is a really great honor for mystery novels. Really kind of a big deal. So that was kind of a shock and a surprise to me that, my Jane Austen inspired fiction is going out there and doing big things. I don't know. I just love kind of, for my writing, I just love exploring and trying new things and trying to figure out, incorporating kind of history and language and other things. No, even when I'm writing like futuristic sci-fi stories, like that is still always a part of it. That's still always an influence. And so that, I mean, I find I'm not a linguist by any means, but I find linguistics really interesting because it is concerned with both, some of the same issues of how it creates meaning and how things have changed and shifted.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's awesome. I know when I was reading the books from your trilogy that are already out, because as you mentioned, the third one is going to come out September 2022. I was super impressed with how much research and how much I learned actually about the time period from reading the books. Like there were historical events that you included in the book, and I was like, oh my gosh, no way that actually happened. And then I looked it up and I was like, wow, this is real. So I thoroughly enjoy reading your work. If anyone is interested in reading, again, the ones that are already out are The Secret Life of Miss Mary Bennet and The True Confessions of a London Spy. So really, really fantastic work. And I'm super glad that you were able to join us on our podcast here.
Thank you so much for having me today. It's been a great pleasure.
Yeah, this has been fantastic. And everybody, we are always live here on Twitch, and you can also find our podcast on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, almost all the big major places. If you have questions, please reach out to us on Instagram at For the Love of Language. Also, feel free to jump in my Discord if you have questions as well. If we don't get to talking about the questions on the podcast, EJ and I can answer them there as well. We love and appreciate all of your support, everybody. And again, a special thanks to Katherine for sharing her work with us and sharing her perspective, being a writer. It's absolutely fantastic and such a pleasure. Hope you all take care of yourselves and have a great day.
Yeah, thank you.